Good, good, good. Alex, can you hear me, my man? How you doing this morning? Or
I
this
can hear you,
afternoon?
Jamal. How are you?
I am doing fine. Had a bit of technical glitches earlier today, but
Yeah, did
I'm working them out.
StreamYard crash or what happened?
I don't know. I didn't have an issue with Alex with Warwick getting on. I saw your thing. I resent the link, and resending the link seemed to solve the issue. So the world is good. I'm going to go with
Okay,
that.
so it was the link.
Yeah.
Maybe
Um.
maybe
Well, I
the
saw.
link got bent out of shape.
Yeah, the link. Yeah, the link was having issues. It was complaining for some reason. Um. We are joined with the man himself, Alex Krainer. He is founder of Krainer Analytics and creator of iSystems Trend Following. He has worked as a market analyst, researcher, trader, and hedge fund manager since 1996. He has authored several books, including Mastering Uncertainty in Commodities Trading, The Grand Deception, and Alex Krainer's Trend Following Bible. And I'm always appreciative when you join me on this. You had an interview with Glenn Deason that I was fascinated by. Because, and you've said this in the interviews with me also, and I'm very curious on your take on this. This idea that we are reaching into a new world, that regardless of how the world seems currently, that it seems static on some level, that's not really what's taking place underneath. That things are shifting, and they're shifting in a way, in part because Europe is effectively losing um, its capability to control and manage the political economy that it had been for the last 100, 200, X hundred years, that it's been able to control, let's say, the masses of the planet. Break this down for me in a political sense and break this down for me in an economic sense. And we can start with the politics first.
Well, depending on how you define it, how you cut it, we've had for the last 5 or 6 centuries, we lived in a very Eurocentric world. What I mean by that is that Europe was the center of the world in terms of culture, finance, economic development, and even in terms of political developments, diplomacy, and military. And so the European model converged on, the model of political governance, converged on something that invariably manifested colonialism, imperialism, imposing itself on the rest of the world. Not just militarily, not just economically, but also culturally. And I think that trend escalated until our days, where it came to the point where everybody had to submit to this monoculture that we imposed. You have to be like this, you have to impose a democracy, you have to effect judicial reforms, you have to introduce these economic measures, you have to open your markets, you have to have LGBT parades, freedom of the media, which in really means you have to let us buy up your main corporate media outlets and control them, and on and on and on. And so little by little they were turning humanity into like a monoculture based on the same principles applied everywhere. And so I think that this is probably the peak Europe, which I think is now giving way to a shift where the gravity of global development is shifting eastward. I mean, now the process is obvious now, but it didn't just start. I think that the wars we're observing is the culmination. It's some kind of an inflection point where things are changing, but the people who are in charge in Europe, the people who are the key beneficiaries of the status quo, are fighting to retain their power, are fighting to stay in charge and to not let these processes unfold. They're trying to reverse this change. And so you have all these discontinuities, like war in Ukraine, war in the Middle East, all these crisis flashpoints that are attempted to get activated again, like the Kashmir, Azerbaijan, Armenia, the Balkans, and so forth. But I think that the tide is turning irreversibly. I think that changes that are happening are very robust. They're very deep rooted, and the people who are trying to reverse them are a relatively small segment of Western populations. I mean, not relatively. I think that they're very, very small segments of the Western populations who have their loyalists in the social hierarchy who carry water for them. But I think that the level of conviction is very, very low. I think that largely European Western population in general are disillusioned with the existing systems, and they're not inclined to fight for them. And so the tide is turning away from Europe, and I think that in this process, the United States is kind of seeking to establish their own self-identity, which they never really did properly. The United States started as a reaction to European colonialism, it was a rejection of the European colonialism. But I think that it was once the United States won their independence, the attempts from the European side, particularly the British Empire, to bring the United States back into their fold never stopped. Colonial wars didn't work. The Civil War in 1960s didn't work. But the slow grinding process of infiltration, penetration of the American ruling structures, and the co-opting of American system did yield results. And then, the United States turned into this basically part of the Western Empire, the most visible and the most powerful part of the Western Empire, which kind of makes it look like we're dealing with an American empire, really. But I don't think we are. I think we're dealing with an empire which is maybe reincarnated in the United States, but which originates from the still undead British Empire. And so now that under the Trump administration, the United States seems to be seeking a new course, you see the reaction on the European side. All these old colonial powers, primarily Britain and France, are simply hysterical because they lost their global cup. They sense that the global cup is, off to greener pastures, which is happening. And so I think that, yeah, go ahead.
No. I was just saying interesting. I mean, because there is this, in the old days, like in Europe, they used to have these wars back and forth. And it was just like Europe would attack, like, let's say France and Britain would be at each other's throats. Germany would get involved. France would get involved. France would attack Russia. Russia would respond. And, as America was generated and created, we ended up engaging in something very similar in regards to getting involved in European wars also. And there's this question of like, why is it that the world continues to just be at each other's throats with these kind of wars that go back and forth, back and forth? You can make an argument that that's something that we effectively took from Europe. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just saying, interesting. But please continue.
Well, when you say we took from Europe, it's not really take as in like, hey, we like this about the Europeans. Let's let's join the party. The Europeans frequently engaged in wars that were too much for them to handle on their own. So they always sought the participation and reinforcement from the United States. For example, World War I was almost completely orchestrated by the British ruling elites. They co-opted the French and the Russians and the Belgians basically with the ultimate objective of destroying Germany, because Germany, starting from the 1870s, rose up as the most credible and most powerful threat to British hegemony over the entire planet. And so, the people who were running the place in London decided, okay, we need to destroy Germany, but we can't destroy her on our own. So let's get the French to fight the war for us, and let's get the Russians to fight their wars for us. And they got the Belgians into the picture, and then they even managed to turn Italy against Germany and Austria-Hungary, even though Italy was formally allied with them. And then, Germany was still a very, very formidable enemy. And so they decided that they need to bring the United States into the fold. So there was this whole big, giant plan where they brought Woodrow Wilson to power in the White House. He even ran on the promise not to get the United States involved in European wars. Then they orchestrated a false flag event with the sinking of the Lusitania. Not that, not false flags in the sense that they sunk Lusitania themselves, but they basically made sure that the Germans sunk it. And then that happened. And then they started even before the Lusitania, they were, they already had control of the American media. And so the campaign of demonization of Germany had ramped up to very high levels of intensity. But then after Lusitania, and then a bunch of American citizens got killed when the ship sank. Then they started the big campaign to say, okay, we have to get involved in this war. Now we're we need to avenge. We need to bring justice. Blah blah blah. We need to make the world safe for democracy and all this. And so the United States joined World War I. Similar scenario played out with World War II. Again, the American people were not interested in fighting a European war. But again, European interests were lobbying hard to get that done. And then, the resistance was finally broken with Pearl Harbor, which was a false flag attack. Again, not a false flag attack as in, they did it themselves, but they pressured and provoked Japan so unscrupulously and so harshly that it was just a matter of how and where and when the Japanese were going to lash out and attack. So when that happened, then they were like, okay, well, we've been attacked. We have to go to war now. And so there's a risk that happens again now because, the Europeans are bending over backwards to get themselves into trouble that they cannot handle themselves. Europe stands no chance in a war against Russia. But what the Europeans can do is get themselves into a world of trouble. And then when they get their nose bloodied, they're going to turn to the United States and say, oh, look what the Russians did to us. You can't possibly leave us by ourselves. You're our daddy and you have to come and defend us. And then, the media in the United States, which are still largely British controlled, maybe they're totally British controlled, I don't know. They're going to start ramping up the propaganda of evil Russians beating up on the poor Europeans. And, these are our traditional allies. And most of our nation has been built by immigrants from these countries. And we are the same flesh and blood, blah, 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 blah. You can imagine all the stories that are going to be played, Russian soldiers bayoneting toddlers in Poland or I don't know what. And then, another little false flag attack somewhere. And there you go. Once more, the United States gets dragged into another global conflict on the European continent. That's the danger. But I think that, unlike World War I and World War II, several things have changed. I think that the gravity of global economic and technological development have already shifted to East Asia, and to an extent to Russia as well. And then we also have the internet, which I think has completely changed the narrative control equation. And so I think that what's going on now is just basically the dying agony of the old system, while the new system is being born. And I always go back to the Confucian saying that when the large tree falls, it falls with great noise and destruction.
Mm-hmm.
Seeds grow in silence. Seeds make no noise when they grow. I think we're kind of living through a version of that. The old obsolete systems in the world are collapsing, and that is generating this noise and destruction, and it's attracting our attention. It's practically mesmerizing everybody. You're just seeing horrible things going on in the world. But what you don't see and what doesn't attract our attention is these seeds that are growing without a question, because they grow in silence, because things are happening by people just minding their own business, except at a higher level that's making a huge example. The Chinese built like 50,000 kilometers of high-speed rail networks.
Yeah.
Russians breaking new grounds with technological advancements that that simply didn't exist before. I've recently come across the story of Azerbaijan building, 4,000 in the space of less than 5 years, building 4,000 kilometers of highways, hundreds of bridges, tunnels, viaducts, and so forth. And this is happening everywhere. This is happening in Africa, in all of the global South. It's just that Europe and the Western world is kind of stuck, like an old, broken, noble family that refuses to give up their status, and that want to use every means possible to make people still bow down to them and revere them and take orders from them and so on, except the world is moving on. And I think that we're living in this moment. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask, what does it mean for the world to have moved to the east? Like for, let's say, the countries of, let's say, BRICS, for example, Russia, China, Iran, etc., seeming to be able to defend themselves. There's that. But
they're going to do what to themselves?
They are able to defend themselves, meaning they're able to defend their sovereignty in a way that may not necessarily have been true in the past. I guess that's, what does it mean for the world to move to the east in this case? How does the world change?
It means that instead of being completely dependent on Western technologies, Western financial centers, Western capital for your nation's development and trade with the rest of the world, that you will now have an alternative, that you will be able to trade with China, with India, that you will be able to plug into their trade settlement systems and possibly new reserve currencies, that you no longer have to abide by the diktat of the IMF and the World Bank, that you no longer have to trade everything for US dollars and then, have your proceeds deposited at the Federal Reserve Bank in New York or in European bank centers. So you have an alternative that hasn't existed in our lifetime. You had to, if you wanted to trade with the rest of the world, if you didn't want to be like North Korea, completely isolated, like the autarky, you simply had to compromise with the West in a lot of ways. You had to open your markets to Western corporations, Western banks. You had to take policy recommendations from the IMF, introduce structural reforms and austerity and loans. You had to be in debt up to your eyeballs to Western financial institutions. And the result is that much of the rest of the world remained almost chronically impoverished, which was by design. It's not an accident. It's by design, because the Western model has always been resource extraction. And if your model is resource extraction, then you want those resources at the lowest possible price.
Right.
And if the local economies of these resource exporting countries grow and develop, then they're going to be using up those resources at home, which means that you're going to have to compete with their domestic economies. So in order to eliminate that competition, you just keep them piss poor, so that they cannot afford to refine their own oil, that they cannot afford to refine their own gold, that they don't use any of those resources in developing their own, infrastructure and industries, that they don't try to compete with you in terms of advanced finished products and so forth. This has been a model. The Chinese model is completely different. They want, they've positioned themselves as the world's manufacturing hub, and so they want a large market of prosperous people who have purchasing power to be their customers. If you want to sell cars, clothes, appliances, computers, phones, whatever, you want people to have money to spend. And so they've been doing this in the same way that they've raised 850 million Chinese people out of poverty over the last 40 years. They want to do the same with the rest of the global South. And they're doing it. I think in 2023 or 24, I forget, another 200 million affluent consumers have been added to the global economy. And that's some kind of a benchmark, which is maybe when per capita disposable income reaches a certain level, I think maybe $5,000 a year. And then these people are considered affluent consumers, which means they have money to spend. So that's the strategy, opposed to the Western colonialist strategy, which deliberately wanted to keep them poor and underdeveloped so they never compete with our industries. So you extract resources from them, you pay them cheap money for it, and then you bring your own finished product and technologies to take that money back from them. So they're always broke, basically. That was the model. And that model is changing. And that new model is obviously being promoted by China, basically, but it's been adopted by the BRICS movement. It's the defining philosophy of the Belt and Road Initiative. And now, the majority of world population, a huge chunk of the global GDP, are already on board with the BRICS and multipolar integrations. And what I mentioned, when I mentioned the United States looking for its identity, I think that even the United States is starting to turn in that direction.
Mm-hmm.